It's a joy to have some of you. This is the third in the series. You've been at all of them. A few of you are probably new here tonight. Unfortunately, our recording last time did not work, so I can't refer you to the website, and I'm as sad as you are on that. But we do have the first one, and hopefully we'll have this one, and then we have one more in the lecture series. We have two wonderful, gifted speakers who have been sharing with us on some incredible parts of Lewis's scholarship that is just too little known. And I hope it has whetted your appetite. And probably many of these books aren't on your shelves at home. And if not, don't despair. They are on our shelves here. You are welcome anytime to come when the reading room is open. It's open 9 to 4, Monday through Friday. And it's also open on Saturday mornings during the academic year. So come, and Elaine, who's manning the technical equipment tonight, doing the AV, she and Laura Schmidt are in the reading room, and they would be glad to help you. And just come sit and read and enjoy. So I won't go through the whole long introductions for the third time, but I will just tell you briefly that Jerry Root, who has been just a long-time friend for decades, many decades now, with the Wade Center, is Associate Professor of Evangelism and Leadership at Wheaton College and Director of the Institute for Strategic Evangelism at the Graham Center. Prolific writer and speaker on Lewis. Jerry will be speaking to us tonight on the Allegory of Love, and that is an incredible work, and Jerry's a wonderful guide for that. Mark Neal, also a longtime friend of the Wade Center, and a co-author with Jerry of The Surprising Imagination of C.S. Lewis. Mark lectures and teaches on Lewis, both in this country and internationally, and he's the Vice President of Digital Marketing for C. Grant and Company, and is currently working on a book examining Lewis's approach to language and how that mirrors an approach to developing ethical frameworks for responding to digital technologies. Mark will be speaking to us tonight on the discarded image, and they'll be doing it in tandem, obviously, so you've got Mark coming first, and then Jerry to follow up, and then we'll have a few moments for Q&A after that. So if you join me in welcoming Mark. Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming and being here tonight. As Marge mentioned, the purpose of this series of talks that we've been giving on the neglected C.S. Lewis is to bring some of Lewis's lesser-known works to light, works that many people haven't heard about or haven't read. And we believe they contain many of his best ideas, ideas that are then later seen in his more theological works, his Christian works, his apologetics, even as in his fiction. And as Marge mentioned, we'll be looking at the discarded image tonight and the allegory of love. So the discarded image is published in 1964. It was originally a series of lectures for students at Oxford University, delivered in 1932 first, and then developed over many years with various editions, which eventually were collated into this book. And Lewis's purpose in writing the book was to facilitate a more accurate reading of the imaginative literature written during the medieval period. And he's specifically focused on the arts, in this case literature, and this book gives us a picture of the medieval model, its cosmology, and its worldview. Lewis likens the book to a map that one consults before traveling. And I think the book also, he mentions that it serves to correct the mistakes of bringing our modern conceptions to bear on these old texts, and so misreading them. So let's begin by setting the stage for how this medieval model came into being. Lewis says that the popular impression of the medievals isn't accurate. We tend to think of them in terms of romances, of ballads, of knights in armor, damsels in distress, of slaying dragons, and so forth. But he says the real temper of that age is not romantic, but classical. Medieval thought, he writes, arose from two primary sources. Firstly, the medievals were a very bookish culture. What they read in books was believed. They were very credulous, and they had lost most of their texts. So the ones they were inherited were a very mixed bag. They had Judaic texts, pagan, Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoical, primitive, Christian, patristic texts. So there was this very mixed bag of texts. The second source from which the medieval thought arose was from the medieval love of system. Medieval man was a codifier. He was an organizer. He concerned himself with making distinctions, tabulations, tidying things up, creating definitions, sorting out. He was incredibly systematic, and Lewis gives us a great metaphor for this. He says they were like this temper of the medievals was like the card index or the card catalog, and if you're not familiar with that, for those of you that are younger, that was how we looked up books in the library prior to everything being put online. Some of the characteristic artistic examples of this medieval character would be the Summa of Thomas Aquinas, Dante's Divine Comedy, even this model that we're describing tonight. And Lewis also mentions the small number of cathedrals where the vision of the original architect was fully realized, and he mentions Salisbury as one of those. Medieval man was also syncretistic and hierarchical in his thinking. Again, because they had inherited so few and such a heterogeneous assortment of texts, and because they were disinclined to disbelieve anything that they read in a book, any contradictions between different texts had to be harmonized. So this is why we see so many different elements jumbled up together in this model. Everything was linked to everything else, and so Lewis says we shouldn't be surprised that the model is not specifically Christian. Medieval man also had a very good understanding of models. He knew that all models are provisional. He understood that all theories should save the appearances, that is, they should get in all the observable data. And this is an idea that comes from John Milton's Paradise Lost. Lewis's friend Owen Barfield writes a whole book on this subject. Not only should all theories save the appearances, but the idea from William of Ockham was added to this, that they should do so with the least number of assumptions, and this is what's more familiarly known as Occam's razor. So not only are all models provisional, they're also metaphorical. And Lewis gives us a great example. He talks about gravity. So if I drop this remote to the ground, the medievals would say it falls there because it wants to return to its home. They called it kindly inclining. Today, if I drop this remote, we understand that it obeys certain laws. Each are equally metaphorical understandings. But Lewis says the metaphor we choose to use makes a difference on the emotional and imaginative level. So I've given you a very brief overview of the medieval temper, its receptivity. So what were some of the influences from which the model was derived that allowed this receptivity to flourish? What were the works that they drew from to create this model? Lewis divides the sources into two periods, and there's a lot of them, so I'm going to be very brief with what I give you here. The first period is the classical period, roughly 50 BC to 125 AD. In this period, we have Cicero, who wrote the Republic. He contributes an understanding of the heavens, the stellatum, which is the region of fixed stars, and we'll get more into the astronomy in a minute. The influence of the planets was also a contribution from Cicero. The moon as a boundary between the heavens and the earth, which actually was an idea he borrowed from Aristotle. Lucan, in his Pharsalia, wrote about, contributed to the model about what lies between earth and the boundary of the moon. Apuleius contributes the idea of the intermediary. Again, this is an idea borrowed from Plato, that any two things need a third to bridge them. And so the great medieval idea of the triad is born. It's a very important idea to the model. Apuleius also contributes the idea of plenitude, or a full exploitation of the universe in the sense of packing it full of significance. So that's the classical period. In the seminal period, Lewis writes that we have both Christian and pagan writers contributing to the model. And he says that pagan beliefs of the time were much closer to Christianity than is typically thought. And it was this period that brought the medieval frame of mind into being. So Plato and subsequent commentaries on Plato contribute very heavily to the model. Chalcidius, who is a translator of Plato, and specifically Plato's Timaeus, which is the cosmology account, he also brought these ideas into the mix. And he further develops the triad idea from Apuleius. Macrobius, in a commentary on Cicero's Republic, brings Neoplatonism into the picture. Pseudo-Dionysius brings a more robust understanding of angels. Boethius, who wrote the Consolation of Philosophy, had a very big impact here, and many of his ideas found their way into the model. So again, this is a very brief synopsis of some of these influences that went into the creation of the model. Now let's look at the model itself. Lewis says this: the human imagination has seldom had before it an object so sublimely ordered as the medieval cosmos. And we'll begin with the heavens. This is a Ptolemaic universe, so it's geocentric, earth-centered. And Lewis says we should think of this universe as unimaginably large, yet finite. It's a universe to be seen in terms of height rather than distance. He says it's like looking up at a towering building. It's a universe to look into rather than out on. As I mentioned earlier, the moon is seen to be the division between the heavens and the earth. Everything above the region of the moon is immutable. It's non-contingent. It's not subject to change or decay. It's incorruptible. Everything below the region of the moon is mutable. It's contingent. It's subject to change and decay. The heavens consisted of 7 planets. 2 of these you'll think are very strange to be added into this mix. The moon was considered to be a planet. Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Above the planets was the stellatum, or the region of fixed stars. Above this was the primum mobile, or the first moved. This was the outermost sphere of that universe, and it was what caused the movement of all the other planets. Above the primum mobile was the divine essence, or God, or the Empyrean. There's also an animistic conception of the heavens. There's intelligences for each sphere. These are conscious and intellectual beings that animate these spheres. And the movement of the universe is created by its love for God. For Greeks, the circle was the symbol of perfection, so the planets move in a circle. That's how they can most closely approximate God's nature. And as they move down through the universe, each planet communicates its knowledge of God to the planet beneath it. So as we move down through this universe, impulse becomes weaker, movement becomes slower, and this leads us to the great principle, the medieval principle of devolution, where all power and speed diminishes as we move down through this universe toward the earth. The planets were also thought to have influences. The moon was thought to produce silver in the ground. The sun was thought to produce gold, and so forth. But they were also thought to produce influences on human psychology, which led to a sort of astrological determinism, the sense that there was not really any free will. The heavens were also considered to be lighted. We know them to be completely dark. Now, the medievals would have described our night as the cone of Earth's shadow. For them, the heavens were lighted, and the heavens were also full of a perpetual sound, the music of the spheres. It was this order and reiteration of the heavens that was seen as the ultimate source of freedom. That order was like a dance of high pageantry. We on Earth are outside the city or castle wall. We're outside that boundary of the moon where everything above is perfection. yet we long to take part. Lewis likens it to animals staring at the fires of an encampment that they can't enter, or rustics staring into the distance at a city. It's a yearning to take part in that perfect, reiterated dance of the heavens. And what is that dance? Simply the yearning to approximate God. So I put together just a quick slide here that I hope will kind of give you a very quick and simple overview of what I've just been talking about as it relates to the heavens. So here we kind of have the universe. I mentioned you've got the 7 different planets. Above them, you've got the stellatum, or the region of fixed stars, and then the prima mobile, or the first move, which moves the rest of the universe as the outermost sphere, and above that is God, of course. Now, as we animate this universe, you'll see that the outermost sphere, which is the biggest, moves the fastest. The prima mobile has a direct comprehension of God, so it has the quickest movement. But as we move down through this universe, each sphere moves a little bit slower, until we get down to the region of the moon, where movement is slowest. And you can see there, it's still traveling around. So again, it's this idea of devolution, that as we move down through the universe, impulse becomes slower, movement becomes weaker, and so forth. And I put here an image of Salisbury's cathedral spire to sort of remind us that this is a universe that we have to look up at, rather than our current understanding of it as just this pathless, trackless wilderness. From the heavens, we move down to the earth. And again, this is considered to be the realm of contingence and decay. Things below the moon were derived from things above, so it was seen to be a pattern, or based on a heavenly pattern. There was an intelligence associated with the earth. It was fortune. And of course, fortune is responsible for the rise and fall of empires, which happens at fortune's whim. And of course, we have the 4 elements. You can see here, we've got the earth. Around the earth is the water. The air is divided into 2 regions. There's the lower air and the upper air. And then above that is the region of fire. And this isn't fire as we would think of it. It was a clear sort of pure essence. The air was considered to be full of these creatures called daimons, and Plato describes these as creatures of a sort of middle nature between gods and men. But the interesting thing about this is it illustrates this idea of the triad that I mentioned, the medieval triad, that the only way that we could communicate with the gods was through an intermediary, and that was the daimon. So this kind of illustrates this relationship. You've got the agent, which is the planet, the medium, which is the air or the daimons, and the patient, which is us on earth. So that gives you kind of the example of the medieval triad. And that triad, it is repeated so much throughout this universe. And I've only given that one example, but there's many more. From the earth, we pass to the human. And I specifically want to focus on the human soul. Now, the human soul was considered to have 3 components. There was the rational component, which gives us a grasp of intelligible truth, as well as reasoning on the way to those truths. The second part is the sensitive, which contains the 10 senses or wits. We have the 5 outward wits, hearing, taste, smell, touch, sight, and the 5 inward wits, which were considered to be memory, estimation, imagination, fantasy, and common wit. And then the third component of the soul is the vegetable, which is responsible for all of the sort of unconscious processes that go on in our bodies. Next, we have the idea of the human past or human history. And Lewis says that there's 3 ways we can understand the past. We can understand it as the Greeks did. History is a story with a plot. Or we can understand it as the Hebrews. The whole past is a revelation of God's purposes. From the Hebrews, we can move on to Christianity, who see all of history as a story based on creation, redemption, the fall, and judgment. But Lewis says that this sort of view of history can lead to what he calls historicism, a belief that in studying the past, we can learn historical and transcendental truth. And Lewis disagreed and believed that this interfered with a true understanding of history. So the medievals followed the Greek idea of history. History is about individuals. It's not about epochs. They wouldn't have understood our modern conception of history. For them, history was meant to do three things: to entertain the imagination, to gratify curiosity, and to discharge a debt toward our ancestors. They had a responsibility to pass on their knowledge. They didn't question the veracity of what they believed, they simply believed in it. Our modern passion for assertion of facts would really have destroyed the imaginative impact of that conception of history. But it was that understanding of history that led to a humility in the face of history. And Lewis writes this: medieval man stood at the foot of a stairway. Looking up, he felt delight. The backward, like the upward glance, exhilarated him with a majestic spectacle, and humility was rewarded with the pleasures of admiration. One had one's place, however modest, in a great succession. One need be neither proud nor lonely. So what was it about this model that influenced the culture of the medievals? Again, Lewis says, other ages have not had a model so universally accepted as theirs, so imaginable and so satisfying to the imagination. There was a big influence in the arts, and specifically artists loved to depict these things for their own sake. For them, everything was more interesting if it carried the mind back to some aspect of the model. Artists loved to restate what was already in existence. And Lewis says this led to the vice of medieval literature, which he calls sheer unabashed dullness. He says it also leads to its virtue, which is an absence of strain in the writing. The stories almost tell themselves. The medieval artists were absorbed in their subject matter. They didn't create new works. The goal was simply to hand on the great stories of the past. And Lewis mentions a number of different works of art and architecture, specifically in Italy. I'm going to show you just a few slides of these. But again, you'll see this idea of this reiteration of concepts from the medieval model. Here we have some of the capitals of the Doge's palace in Venice. This is one of the planets and the planet's children. The Il Salone in Padua, this is a huge room full of these panels. And these panels, again, illustrate different planets. They illustrate the influences of the planets on different humans. The old sacristy church in San Lorenzo of Florence, this is actually kind of interesting. You're actually here, this is a picture of looking up into a dome, which is over an altar. And the medievals created these, a number of these different sky maps based on certain important events that occurred in the church. And so on the date that an important event occurred, they would record the night sky on that day exactly as it appeared. And the gods were seen to preside over this important event. Campanile of Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence. This is a tower. It has many different sculptures and statues on it. These are the 7 planets looking down. Santa Maria Novella in Florence. Again, the 7 planets allied with the 7 liberal arts. The Shii Chapel, and again, this is a dome that we're looking up into. At the very top, you can see God, the Creator. Ranged around him are the 7 planets. The Villa Farnesina in Rome. Again, just more images of the heavens. And so again, like the medievals just loved this stuff. They packed their artwork full of significance, and it was just repetition upon repetition upon repetition because their minds loved to dwell on this stuff. And Lewis says they had the realizing imagination. They were able to make us see what they saw. This created significance. The model itself had a built-in significance. Moderns often think, Lewis says, that they can't know the significance of reality. But for the medievals, the model itself had a significant form, and it was a manifestation of the wisdom and goodness that created it. This inspired humility in them. There was no self-aggrandizement for authors like there is today. They would have seen this sort of thing as an admission of poverty. For them, literature exists for three purposes: to teach what is useful, to honor what deserves honor, and to appreciate what is delightful. They were content to have their small role in the great pageant of history. So what is it about this model that we should care about now today? Well, first of all, I think we should care about it because it helps us to understand Lewis better. I don't think that you can read the Chronicles of Narnia or the Space Trilogy fully if you haven't read The Discarded Image, because Lewis brings so many of those ideas to those books. And in fact, some of you will be familiar with Michael Ward, who wrote a book called Planet Narnia. And in that book, he brings forth the idea that each of the 7 chronicles is associated with one of the 7 planets from the medieval cosmology. It's fascinating stuff. It also helps us to understand Lewis as a man. He took imaginative delight in this model. It was of great imaginative importance to him. He says that few constructions of the imagination seem to me to have combined splendor, sobriety, and coherence in the same degree. Another reason we should care is that it helps us to better understand the purpose of models. Now, the medieval model ultimately wasn't true. In 1572, in the constellation of Cassiopeia, a supernova appeared which altered the conception of the heavens. Prior to this, they thought that the heavens were unchangeable. Now they had to alter their knowledge once this supernova appeared. And so Lewis reminds us that all models are provisional, all models are metaphorical. We might say that this particular medieval model isn't true, but Lewis says we have to be careful when we talk about the truth of models. In the 19th century, he writes, it is believed that we could know ultimate physical reality by inference from our sense experience. So the truth of any given thing would be a mental replica of the thing itself. Today, Lewis writes, the sciences and mathematics are as close as we can get to the reality. But math isn't really imaginable, and even the mathematicians and scientists themselves have models. They can illustrate one aspect of truth only by an analogy. Sometimes they can only suggest. And again, Lewis gives us a great metaphor. He talks about the modern conception of space as the curvature of space. He says that's comparable to the medieval conception of God as a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. Both are nonsense at the level of ordinary thinking. But by accepting the first, Lewis writes, we aren't knowing or enjoying truth in the same way it was once thought possible. And he says, what we know now is that we can't know, in the old sense, what the universe is like. So there's an imaginative loss there. So we can't just dismiss the change in models as simply progress from error to truth. No model can ultimately explain reality, and no model is ultimately just a fantasy. Each age has to account for the facts, but Lewis warns us not to idolize any particular model, because it will be superseded by a different model. It will become a discarded image. A third reason we should care about the medieval model, I think it helps to give us a proper sense of humility. It puts things into perspective. It helps put our place in history into perspective. I think especially in an age where the world seems to revolve around the self, and we've sort of lost the historical continuum. The fourth reason we should care, I think the medieval model helps to re-enchant our world. We can learn, as Lewis mentioned, to develop the satisfied imagination, to find joy and delight in the familiar. And I think this model helps to recapture a sense that the universe is crowded with God. The knowledge and significance of this model can add richness to our own story. Helps us to see the world anew as if for the first time. And I mentioned back in my talk in October a quote by Chesterton, which I'm going to relay again now because I think it's appropriate. And Chesterton writes this. He says, "There is a law written in the darkest of the books of life, and it is this. If you look at a thing 999 times, you are perfectly safe. If you look at it for the 1,000th time, you are in frightful danger of seeing it for the first time." So again, I think this model just gives us a great opportunity to be reminded that the universe is crowded with God. It's packed full of significance. And I think a great way to end this talk is to read a very short poem. And I think it's a great reminder of what the medievals took for granted, and it's called God's Grandeur. It's by Gerard Manley Hopkins. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not reck his rod? Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge, and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And though the last light off the black west went, O morning at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with bright wings.
I can't even turn on my microphone. I used to tell people I thought The Discarded Image, if you were going to miss a C.S. Lewis book, skip that one. And I used to tell people that. I've read it I don't know how many times, and I'd say it's one of his most important books. It is the fruit of his reading great and vast amounts of literature. Next time we'll be talking on the English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama. To write that book, Lewis read every book written in English in the 16th century, and every book translated into English. So it's going to be a really long lecture next time. But the point is, his breadth of reading made it possible for him to write about The Discarded Image with great authority. And even after hearing your talk, Mark, I'm going to go back and reread it again. It's such a good book. I'm talking about The Allegory of Love. This was a book that established Lewis's academic reputation as a medievalist and a medieval historian. It's a complex book, so I'm going to do something different. I usually talk more extemporaneously. I'm going to read the lecture, so please forgive me. That's why I tried to get copies for people so you can follow along. C.S. Lewis and The Allegory of Love, neglected but of great importance. Norman Cantor, former Rhodes Scholar, Fulbright Professor, and Professor at New York University, wrote Inventing the Middle Ages, in which he considers the influence of 20th century medieval scholars. By his standards of assessment, he places C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien at the top of the list of all medievalists of the last century. Then he observes, of all medievalists of the 20th century, Lewis and Tolkien have gained incomparably the greatest audience, although 99% of their readers have never looked at their scholarly work. And of Lewis, he notes that he had established his reputation as a leading medieval literary historian with The Allegory of Love in 1936. Before the publication of this book, Cantor says, no one in the English-speaking world had up to then the learning, insight, and courage to attempt such a sophisticated definition of high medieval culture. There had been valuable discussions of particular poets and treatises on philosophy and theology. But Lewis tried to define the essence of 20th century literary imagination and did so in a formula that has withstood the challenge of a half-century of research and reflection. In fact, Cantor observes that Lewis saw more deeply into medieval culture than the Neo-Thomists did. Here it is worthy to note that while many of the interpreters of the development of intellectual history tend to follow the philosophers and theologians, Lewis propounds the merit of following the ideas that develop along literary lines. Furthermore, the medieval imagination, Lewis summed up near the end of his life, is not a transforming imagination like Wordsworth's or a penetrating imagination like Shakespeare's. It's a realizing imagination, as Mark referred earlier. Cantor adds, while Lewis left a great many questions unanswered or even unasked about the nature of the Middle Ages, what he had to say was persuasive and largely incontestable. So what was it Lewis had to say in this book that established his reputation as a first-rank scholar and literary historian? What did the medieval realizing imagination discover? Margaret Hannay suggests that Lewis's point of the Allegory of Love was to refute 5 misunderstandings of Spencer currently in the literary circles of Lewis's day regarding his Platonism, his moralism, his Protestantism, and so forth. While Lewis does discuss these matters, they're not the point of Lewis's book. And such clarifications would not have established Lewis's reputation as a literary historian the way the Allegory of Love in fact did. A closer read of the text with an eye towards grasping the overall reach and flow of what Lewis has posited can be found in literary scholar Stephen Yandel's essay on the text. He rightly observes that Lewis's point, building to a crescendo throughout the medieval courtly tradition, is for Spencer to employ the allegorical form masterfully as a way of showing the inner complexities associated with passionate, Christian, married love. The thesis of the Allegory of Love sets forth how the Christian concept of marriage was elevated gradually and idealized through the Romantic literature of the Middle Ages. Furthermore, what Lewis says may have significant application for the current challenges to marriage confronting our culture today. However, applications to current circumstances will have to be drawn inferentially. Certainly, Lewis could not have anticipated the state of affairs surrounding the present interest in same-sex attraction. Nothing in the history of thought and culture could have allowed him to expect such a thing. Although Lewis was a classicist and very familiar with texts like Plato's Symposium, where allusions to pedophilia are mentioned, nevertheless, they're not paraded as something common or praiseworthy. Such things were present in that culture and duly noted, but neither commended nor endorsed. He was aware and writes about homosexuality present in the public school days, his public school days, but again, not as something to be pursued. If anything, it was more like a curiosity or worse, an occurrence among boys whose school lives were lived on the margins of their own families. Their sexuality was awakening, and there were few to guide them through this adolescent anomaly. However, at its worst, it was predatory and abusive. But the fact is, Lewis does not write much about homosexuality because it was not significant to him, and certainly not important as something looming large in the culture, nor could he have imagined the place same-sex attraction would come to have in our culture today. Furthermore, the idea of same-sex marriage never occurs in his writing, and it couldn't have been further from his mind. He still swam within the wide stream of 3,000 years of Western history where such a thing was unheard of. Perhaps the closest thing we can find in his writing about extraordinary and untraditional marriage unions is in a publication discussed about science fiction titled Unreal Estates. One of the participants in the dialogue mentioned that there was a science fiction author who imagined a world where there were 5 genders and marriage was an affair of all 5 coming together in a single union. Lewis's response to the discussion: happiness must have been very difficult to achieve in that world. The absence of comment by Lewis about same-sex attraction does not mean that he was unaware of challenges that faced traditional marriage in the past. In fact, the frequency with which he writes about marriage provides much grist for thought. Most prominently, however, Lewis detects one particular challenge to marriage as evidenced in the Middle Ages. It was the age of the Crusades and chivalry, an age characterized by the idealization of knights and their armor, quests, and the need to rescue damsels in distress. And yet, in this time, marriage was almost unquestionably threatened by adultery. It was not from the homosexual world where marriage was minimized, but from the world of unbridled heterosexuality. The Allegory of Love, Lewis's monumental work about the medieval love allegory, traces developments in the literature of that age, moving from the celebration of adultery to literature that elevates the Christian ideal of marriage and holds it in high regard. Lewis looks at some of the most significant medieval texts in order to mark this development. There is much of ancillary value in Lewis's exploration, but since this development towards a Christian view of marriage was Lewis's main point, it is the thread I will follow in this lecture. As Lewis begins his exploration of the medieval allegory, he writes that humanity does not pass through phases as a train passes through stations. Being alive, it has the privilege of always moving, yet never leaving anything behind. Whatever we have been, in some sort we are still. And elsewhere, Lewis adds, but surely arrested development consists not in refusing to lose old things, but in failing to add new things. The maturation process demands a certain rootedness in the past with its traditions and accumulated knowledge. But if growth is occurring, there must also be new ground explored and new horizons reached. While a new experience may provide a challenge to one's conceptual framework, nevertheless, out of this challenge, development can occur. Orthodox theology has always progressed whenever heresies occurred. These called for change in the presently held conceptual framework. This fact is supported by the history of church councils. Heresies must be answered, and these answers led to more robust theology. And this is no less the case in the way human thought has developed through the ages on any given topic, not least of which is marriage. But when understanding increases and progresses occurs, its development is likely to be mirrored by the literature of the age. Furthermore, particular literary forms are often created as a vehicle for bearing certain ideas. In the Allegory of Love, Lewis writes of continuity and change. Change in a world of mutabilities is to be expected. At least two kinds of change may be observed. A change of kind. The present conceptual framework has been falsified by unbending realities, and the framework or paradigm must now be abandoned for better, as we heard about the discarded image. Or a change of degree. New data demands some adjustment in currently held beliefs, but these beliefs need not be abandoned. A tree does not have to give up its interior rings just because it adds new. Nevertheless, these beliefs must be adjusted to keep up with the data, and therefore one's belief assimilates the new data. But another way, Lewis's biggest idea, one that can be traced in all of his books, is that reality is iconoclastic. The iconoclast breaks idols. I may have an image of God or anything else for that matter. The new image may come after reading a book, listening to a lecture, or following a conversation. New pieces of the puzzle have come together to form a clearer image, but if I hold too tightly to the present image, it will become an idol and an obstacle to further growth. Lewis reminds readers that God, in his mercy, always kicks out the walls of any temples we build for him, because he wants to give us more of himself. Furthermore, we want a clearer grasp of the world where we live. Even the truths we hold are subject to degrees of change. We have yet to plumb the depths of any truth we presently grasp, nor have we imagined all the possible applications of any given truth we know. We will never have a last word or a complete understanding of anything, but this does not mean we cannot have a sure word about some things. All truths ought to be held with this humility and honesty. Additionally, these attempts to grasp this continuity and change are destined to affect our interior life. We respond to our world not only by means of reason, but also with the heart. We are creatures of passion as well as intellect. Lewis notes that in medieval times, allegory became the literary form developed to speak of and depict the interior life. He writes, the inner life, and especially the life of love, religion, and spiritual adventure, has therefore always been the field of true allegory. For here there are intangibles which only allegory can fix, and reticences which only allegory can overcome. Lewis also observed that the function of allegory is not to hide but to reveal, and it is properly used only for that which cannot be said or so well said in literal speech. Furthermore, Lewis points out that the subject of courtly love filled much of the literature of the Middle Ages. It was a preoccupation of the leisured classes who had the time to write. Courtly love was identified by its 4 characteristics: humility, courtesy, the religion of love, and adultery. The fact that adultery was idealized, an idealized feature of courtly love, may surprise some, but Lewis reminds his readers, in an age where marriages were arranged, one's passions were generally focused towards someone other than one's spouse. Lewis notes the following. First, in feudal society, marriages had nothing to do with love. Second, all matches were matches of interest, and worse still, of an interest that was constantly changing. Therefore, marriages were frequently dissolved. Furthermore, any idealization of sexual love in a society where marriage is purely utilitarian must begin by being an idealization of adultery. Lewis also notes that according to the medieval view, passionate love itself was wicked and did not cease to be wicked if the object of it were your wife. Consequently, the church taught that ardent love, even of one's spouse, was a mortal sin. And those in the Middle Ages concluded that true love is impossible in marriage. The theologians and the philosophers did little to restore marriage to its proper place. Therefore, it can be noted that as in our day, while the institution of marriage is threatened by unique challenges, so too in the Middle Ages there were challenges. And in fact, it is how romantic passion came to be linked to marriage, which is a developing exposition of Lewis's The Allegory of Love. He says this transfer of passion to one's spouse rather than to one's paramour is the greatest change to occur in medieval poetry. And that, listen to this, compared with this revolution, the Renaissance is a mere ripple on the surface of literature. What is to be noted is that the transformation, as Lewis traces it, did not come from the writings of the theologians, but from poets, in fact, the Christian poets. Once again, it can be seen that it is artists who are more often the shapers of culture, for good or for ill. What exactly was this courtly love? What was it like? How might it be understood? For an illustration, one can draw on Lewis's own explanation of that period in his life when he flirted with idealism. What he says about his own pre-conversion, idealism, provides a rough analogy to this religion of love. Real quick, Lewis had been an atheist. He becomes a materialist. He eventually sees that atheism doesn't work. There's order in the universe. He sees that materialism doesn't work. Matter is not eternal. There are changes. It has influences on it. So what is making things progress in any way whatsoever? And Lewis said, well, there must be, because he's still a non-believer, he says, there must be then some spirit. He leans towards Hegel's idealism, guiding and directing these things. And so, consequently, after a long bout with atheism and materialism, and as its supporting worldview, and having seen the bankruptcy of both, Lewis turned to idealism. He writes in Surprised by Joy that this idealism was for him a convenience and provided him a quasi-religion, which is what the religion of courtly love was, a quasi-religion. He observed it was all eros streaming up, but no agape darting down. There was nothing to fear, better still, nothing to obey. This idealism, which came with no sense of obligation to anything truly transcendent, is analogous to the religion found in courtly love. There was religious devotion to one's beloved, but the obligations were all subjective feelings tethered to no transcendent reality. Tracing the movement from courtly love to a Christian concept of marriage in The Allegory of Love. In The Allegory of Love, Lewis explains how marriage was rescued from the challenges of courtly love. To do this, he traces chronologically the gradual changes that occurred in the literature of the age and its effect on the cultural consciousness. First, Lewis considers the romance of the rose. After the Bible and Boethius is the consolation of philosophy, Lewis says it may have been the most influential book of the Middle Ages. By the way, when I read that stuff in Lewis, I go read those books. I hope you will too, because there's rich treasure in those books as well. For this present study, it's not necessary to unpack all that Lewis writes about the romance of the rose. What is important here is simply to note that it is the story of a lover whose deepest convictions remained opposed to his love, and who knew that he acted neither well nor wisely. Here consciousness is awakened to conscious. The adultery, so consciousness, the awareness, that which is opposite of unconscious is awakened to conscience, moral knowledge or moral sense. The adultery that was once prized creates internal conflict, and yet the lover's behavior remains contrary to what he knows he ought to do. The sentiment is like that of Romans 7, the finding in ourselves that what we are doing we do not want to do. How is this to be explained? Why do we rush to whatever is the immediate pleasure before us? Why do we avoid the virtue of temperance, which resists the enticement of immediate pleasure in order to gain the greater though more remote good? In this struggle, perhaps we find evidence that our wounds, accumulated in a very fallen world, are far deeper than our convictions. When pleasure and convictions clash, it is the convictions that are often sacrificed. And until whatever wound drives us is healed, the convictions will always suffer infirmity. What is important to notice here for this present study is that the passions are directed towards someone who is not the lover's spouse, and there is guilt about the matter, but nothing is done to correct the error. Nevertheless, in this recognition of human failure and in the guilt that follows, Lewis chronicles a small step found in the Romance of the Rose, which will eventually lead to the discovery that passion can be found legitimately in marriage. Change is occurring, and a thread of continuity is becoming visible. Troilus and Cressida. The next text in the progression of those Lewis examines is Chaucer's Troilus and Cressida. He observes that Chaucer's greatest poem is the consummation, not the abandonment, of his labors as a poet of courtly love. It is a wholly medieval poem. In what way does Lewis mean a wholly medieval poem? It is simply that Chaucer is drawing on the romantic literature that was produced before him and use it as a source for his own material. But Chaucer's embellishment is to take the passions described in courtly love, and though he does not turn them towards marriage per se, he does turn his story towards the Christian God. I do not have time to recount the story of Troilus and Cressida, but simply say here, it is the best extra-biblical story of love I have ever read, and I found it both tragic and deeply moving. I remember when I finished it the first time, I was on an airplane. I'm a high T on the Myers-Briggs. I'm not supposed to cry. But I just started bawling after I read it on this airplane. It wasn't a crowded flight, but I'm scrunching down. It wasn't that I was embarrassed of the tears, but I knew if somebody asked me about it, there's no way I could do justice to this world I had been living in for the last 3 weeks. This glorious story. Anyway, if one has not read it, I would encourage him to do so. Nevertheless, for our purposes here, it is important to note that while the concept of courtly love is strong in the text and love is embodied in fornication, even so Chaucer begins the story with prayers. This connection of love and true religion is unique and noteworthy. Chaucer asks the reader to pray for him that he might tell the story of Troilus and Cressida well. And this he does. Shakespeare, who will borrow from Chaucer, should have also asked his readers to pray for him, for he does not tell the story nearly as well. Furthermore, Chaucer asks for more prayer. He asks for the reader's prayers on behalf of those who have never loved, that they might know love. He asks for prayers for those who have been unrequited in their love, that they might find happiness and repose from their true beloved. Now, by the way, real quick, have you ever noticed all the literature on unrequited love? I think it awakens in us something of the circumstances of God. God is the greatest unrequited lover ever. He made us for himself. He made us to love him, and we spurn him. He knows what that heart is like. Also, Chaucer asks for prayers for those who have once been in love and have now fallen out of it, that they might be restored. He asks for prayers for those who are in love, that they might remain in it. This turning to heaven in order to understand more fully the nature of love for the beloved is unique in its time. Yet it underscores a kind of desperation one might expect when all one's hope is tethered to mere human love. It is filled with soaring expectations that are at risk of crashing disappointments due to human limitation and fallenness. Certainly human love can be good, but it cannot replace divine love. Chaucer, in fact, makes this clear. Regarding the desperation of Troilus' situation, Lewis observes that all men have waited with ever-decreasing hope, day after day, for someone or something that does not come, and all would willingly forget the experience. Marge, I wonder if that didn't reflect the times he wrote to his father to come see him before he went off in World War I and his dad never came. Anyway, Chaucer's story ends with Troilus' heart desperately broken and he's defeated on the battlefield. And yet, he has an out-of-body experience where his soul transcends the battlefield after his death. From this elevated perspective, he sees what must ultimately be made of all earthly loves. And at this moment, Chaucer ends the story with one last prayer. Blessed Jesus, turn all our loves to thee. As Lewis observes, Chaucer, never more truly medieval and universal, recalls the young, fresh folks of his audience from human to divine love, recalls them home, as he significantly says. This idea, if not first encountered in Dante, is at least deeply developed in Dante and widely distributed through him to influence many other authors who follow in his wake. Now, suffice it to say, Lewis underscores that Chaucer has few rivals and no masters. In his hands, the story of love and passion directs the heart to God if one ever hopes to make significant sense of human love. Passion in marriage is not yet emphasized, but there is clearly movement in a direction away from courtly love, the religion of love. Again, here is a kind of continuity observed in the context of change. Chaucer has set the stage for the coming of Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, with its elevation of marriage as a place where romantic human passions ought to have their highest expression. Still, Lewis has his readers consider a few more phases in the transition from the idealization of adultery to God's ideal in Christian marriage as the proper place, the God-given place to express and find fulfillment for one's earthly passions. Lewis highlights many poets worthy of note in the Allegory of Love. I will limit this discussion to those who in fact most dramatically contribute in some way to the eventual idealization in marriage. John Gower. Lewis observes that John Gower is first among these transitional poets, and as Lewis says, his significant contribution lies in his explicit concern for form and unity. The great contribution he makes to the literature of his age is to take seeming contrasts and weave them together into a coherent whole. This particular feature in his writing is something generally like Christianity itself. If Christianity is true, and what is observed in the scriptures is accurate, then existing tensions are often exacerbated in a fallen world. Estrangements lead to deeper estrangements, and alienations proliferate unless they can be woven back together by grace. Thus in Gower, as in Christianity, we see reconciled transcendence and immanence. Eternity can be encountered in mutability. God's sovereignty and human free will may be harmonized and also reconciled. So too concord can be found between the genders, male and female can be made into one. The universe created by the triune God is a place where unity and diversity can coexist. This transition step found in Gower is important in the movement from courtly love to the Spenserian reconciliation, uniting passions and marital love with great literary success. Spenser, inheritor of all that has come before him, will rescue marriage from the challenge of courtly love and the practice of adultery. Consequently, in this regard, Gower is an important link in the chain from Chaucer to Spenser, as Lewis observes. Again, Lewis reminds his readers that there are few absolute beginnings in literary history, but there's endless transformation. While many writers are noted by Lewis, the following will be sufficient to show that he keeps to his task, revealing how the literature of the Middle Ages went through incremental changes using allegory as a literary form to connect passion to marriage until other abuses began to drop out of the picture. The King's Quair is the next book highlighted by Lewis, and of this work Lewis wrote that James I of Scotland sat down to write what most emphatically deserves to be called some new thing. This is because James wrote of his own love for the woman who became his wife. And Lewis says that in this work one sees clearly such transition that as the love longing becomes more cheerful, it also becomes more moral. Consequently, Lewis describes it as the first modern book of love. Next is John Ludgate, who wrote The Temple of Glass. Here the hero appeals to Venus that she might make a way not to adultery, but to marriage. In a passage that makes the heart sink, Lewis echoes the plight of young women in all ages, be it the Middle Ages or even young women today trapped in the bondage of human trafficking or groped by predatory pigs, that Ludgate pleads for girls forced into marriage to mend their fathers' estates. and for yet younger and more deeply wrong oblates, snatched from the nursery to the cloister for the good of their fathers' souls, using their fathers to extend their possessions, or their daughters to extend their possessions, or using their daughters to somehow placate God because they knew they were sinners, and rather than turning to Christ, they did these horrible things. This text is so contemporary. Each age has those who have drifted from a traditional view of marriage. The abusers become self-referential and thereby tend towards utilitarianism. In denying the humanity of others, their own is unwittingly diminished. This, of course, is a theme Lewis develops profoundly in his fiction. The Great Divorce certainly comes to mind. And in his nonfiction, most profoundly in The Abolition of Man. The abuses against God's design for conjugal fidelity have needed restoration in every age. Again, this is a reason why the allegory of love is so important and in some ways so contemporary. In William Neville, The Castle of Pleasure, the literary form develops into what Lewis calls a moral allegory. With Neville, Lewis notes that what was originally a moral necessity is becoming a structural characteristic, and the love which he celebrates is a perfectly respectable love ending in marriage. The change is duly noted, and the way is paved for Spenser's The Faerie Queene. Change is occurring, yet it is measured by the continuity. Spenser's goal for The Faerie Queene. Apart from writing The Faerie Queene to give pleasure to his readers, Lewis summarizes Spenser's underlying purpose. The goal of love, which Spenser here celebrates, is lawful, carnal fruition within marriage. To accomplish this goal, Spenser was influenced by the Italian epic. In fact, Lewis says that influence is too weak a word for the relation which exists between the Italian epic and the Faerie Queene. The style was best utilized by Ariosto and even more by Boiardo's Orlando Furioso and the Innamorato. Supreme characteristics of this genre are the speed, the pell-mell of episodes, the crazy carnal jollity of Boiardo are his very essence. Lewis says the formula is to take any number of chivalrous romances and arrange such a series of coincidences that they interrupt one another every few pages. There's no rest. The action gives way to new and constant twists and adventure. The action of an Indiana Jones movie would best capture something of the flavor for a modern comparison. And since Spenser co-opts the Italian epic for an English audience, utilizing a literary form so beloved and popular in his day, Lewis suggests his readership embraced him all the more and loved him. While the detail of the Faerie Queene is exciting in its own right for the purpose of this paper, the point is that utilizing this literary form, what Spenser has to say about marriage spread like wildfire and was popularized. As Lewis observed of the Faerie Queene, the poem is full of marriages. Furthermore, these marriages are laudable, celebrated, and passionate. The image inculcated into the popular culture affected change for the good. This is the very point Lewis is making in The Allegory of Love. I will make application of this in my conclusion, but suffice it here to say, Lewis as an academic was gaining an ear and an eye for something of the biblical ideal. He did not compromise his craft to preach a sermon, but his careful research and convincing, winsome writing gained credit for the biblical idea in a unique way. Also, he realized that his scholarship could be a vehicle to help others take notice of the pleasures that God intended for marriage. Furthermore, Lewis clearly took delight in his material, and elsewhere he says, Spenser was certainly in his own way a religious man, and also a religious poet. But the deepest, most spontaneous, most ubiquitous devotion of that poet goes out to God, not as one of the Platonists, not as the Calvinist predestinator, not even as the incarnate Redeemer, but as the glad Creator, the fashioner of flower and forest and river, of excellent trout and pike, of months and seasons, of beautiful women and lovely nights, of love and marriage, of sun, moon, and planets, of angels above all light. He sees the creatures, in Charles Williams' phrase, as illustrious with being. Lewis uses Spenser's vision of life to awaken in his readers a similar longing and desire. And from here one sees some of the Spenserian ideals manifesting themselves in a variety of ways in Lewis's other works. Time does not permit a full exploration, but a few poignant examples might make the case. The awakening of love and the hope for passion between the once psychologically estranged Mark and Jane Studdock in That Hideous Strength. Lewis's speculation about unfallen sexuality in A Preface to Paradise Lost. Ideas about Christian marriage expressed in Mere Christianity, as well as others developed in the texts on Eros in The Four Loves come quickly to mind. Concluding observations. I would like to make some concluding observations. While this is no exhaustive study either of marriage or what Lewis thought of marriage, it does take into account some significant texts upon which readers may draw to discover what Lewis thought of this great God-given gift. At least 4 observations might be noted. First, the institution of marriage has undergone observable changes over the years from time to time and culture to culture. The development observed above indicates one thread of change recorded and marked by Lewis in the tapestry of medieval literature. But can also be observed that never in the past has marriage been seen as anything but a cross-gender experience. Furthermore, whatever anomalies might have threatened marriage in the past, they have not thus far been able to destroy the traditional views of marriage. Challenges have certainly come, but none have lasted. Lewis's look at marriage through the lens of a literary historian, that is, over the long haul, should give those with any present concern some degree of hope. Second, marriage as Lewis would see it is one of design. This design, like all of creation, is from God. Since this is the case where the scriptures are unambiguous, any compromise is likely to imperil the joys and benefits of marriage as God intended them. The continuity of history regarding marriage rests in this, that marriage is the gift of God. And human passions are best realized in marriage when God is at the center of the relationship as prescribed by Scripture. Furthermore, if there is a design for marriage, creation implies intention, then what God has in mind for marriage must ultimately be for His glory and purpose. Furthermore, what is most pleasurable for His creatures is present in the design and made malignant when divorced from the design. It stands to reason that any pleasure in a world made by God will be best approximated in obedience to God. So it is in the Christian view of marriage. Third, Lewis chronicled in The Allegory of Love the cultural shift in attitudes whereby romantic passion found its highest expression in marriage. This account is heartening. While history seems to be a record of cultural entropy, nevertheless, in this matter of marriage, Lewis unpackaged a positive change that occurred over time. Was this change for the better due to some kind of divine guidance? Perhaps. Was it due to human and cultural adjustment to reality? Were graces operational over time so that what was hardwired in human nature by the operations of a great common grace provided the means for creatures to be at some level remade into the image of God? If this might be so, it is interesting to note that the return to a biblical ideal did not occur by means of a revival in response to a fiery prophetic preaching. Rather, the continuity and change occurred slowly over time. Literature kept the record of the cry of the human heart longing for its ideal, embedded in its very soul since creation. If we are designed by God, does it not also stand to reason that we should function in a particular way? Certainly it must be true that if we mess with nature, eventually we will have hell to pay. Whatever the case, Lewis marks a change in the understanding of marriage over time. Full romantic passion for another ought to be found in marriage, not outside of it. And while this has not been perfectly realized from a biblical point of view, the change that occurred in the Middle Ages was a change for the good. This historical instance should be a cause for hope no matter how things in the culture may look currently. Just as the challenge of courtly love and its affront to marriage did not last, perhaps we can hope and thereby expect that any fresh challenge to the traditional view of marriage will not last either. Lastly, it must be noted that it was Christian authors working through the fiction and poetry of the Middle Ages who rescued marriage from the threats of adultery and utility. They played a significant hand in restoring to marriage the high biblical standard of one man and one woman sharing in all of the complexities of life, including sexual passion and fulfillment in producing generations to follow. It is important to note that a kind of cultural restoration of the dignity of marriage came from the fiction writers of the Middle Ages. Again, as a case in point, it would appear that the poets did more at that time to rescue marriage from its utility than the theologians. If this is so, it might be advantageous to consider the use of the arts to elevate marriage once again to its biblical idealization. In fact, While one could suggest the popular arts in their wide range of expression have done much to assault the biblical understanding of marriage, it might require the use of the arts to once again engage the imagination to visualize the restoration of the biblical ideal. It may be possible for artists to create in a way that popular culture once again thirsts for the pleasure of all things biblical. In the Allegory of Love, Lewis takes his readers on a journey to discover the glory of God's ideal of marriage as it was traced in the developing literature of the Middle Ages. It is a journey as timely today as it was in the days of Chaucer and Spenser. In this way, Lewis, as a faithful, integrated Christian scholar, provides an example how such scholarly work can function as an apologetic for the faith, speaking to the culture without sounding preachy. Okay, there you go. Come up, please. So I'm sorry to have read that, but you could see there was a lot of complexity. Any questions? It's too late for abridgments. Yes, what do you got for us, Justice?
We talked about, you just clearly enunciated how the art and the cultures, and I belong to an arts group, can impact a society. It captures our imagination. And I noticed when we imagine things, we follow through on it. We find a way to follow through on it. In this, I didn't quite get the timeline. How much time did you think it took to change for this to really start to really, I mean, we're looking at a century. We're looking at how much time are we thinking from clearly it was adultery was okay. Now we're looking at clearly we must have romance in our marriage.
Hundreds of years. Hundreds of years. And the thing is, though, this doesn't mean that there were no people who were in love with their spouses and doing it right. But it does mean in the literature it had kind of dropped out. And even some of the biblical understanding was lacking because the theologians thought that all passion, all sexual passion was sinful, whether it be with your spouse or not. You can read Augustine. Augustine's my favorite theologian. But if you want to read where he's really messed up, read what he writes about sexuality. The guy was goofy in that regard. And some of this comes back then. So you're getting Augustine's influence. That's, 5th century, right? And so consequently, we're talking now coming up to where he's seeing authors in the maybe Dante, but 13th, 14th century, where the change is beginning to occur. So it's a long period of time, but that's in the literature. That doesn't mean that the common man, less affected by some of these things, was not enjoying things the way God intended.
And Augustine had fathered a child out of wedlock, so he probably had some cause for that in his own mind.
He had
not?
some difficulties, which should make us all mindful of the fact that it doesn't make any difference how good the person is. They've got goofiness. It doesn't make any difference how goofy the person is. There's some dignity there. Anyway, thank you, sir. Anybody else? Yes?
Mark, got a question about, you mentioned that the medieval mind tried to harmonize things that they read. It seems like we're stuck in a time where we don't try to harmonize anything. We tend to push things to the pole. Would there be any profitability in looking back at medievalists to help our own society?
Sure. So the reason that they harmonized is because they had inherited, as I mentioned, just a very sort of assorted group of texts. There was no unity between the texts. It was just a mishmash of stuff from all over the place. So it kind of forced them to do that. And as I mentioned, they were very credulous, so they didn't disbelieve anything that they read. If it was in a book, it was believed. And so their solution for this group of texts was just to kind of try to make everything fit. And they actually did it. And in our culture today, I don't think we have that problem. We have so much knowledge about every single thing you can think of. We haven't lost any texts. In fact, our texts are multiplying exponentially. But I think the way that they went about it created for them a very imaginative and imaginable worldview, which I think we've lost. So I think that's one benefit that we could think about as we look back at how they did things. I don't know, you might have more to add on that.
No, I think that's fair. You'd mentioned they were systematizers, but they were also embellishers. That's why you do see some change and transformation take place. It's interesting, though, because you can talk about the fact that they had such harmony in their system, and yet here was this thing about marriage that had gotten goofy and gotten off the rails, which I think is another reminder that a person could think well in one area and not so well in another area. That's why you've got all the people in Scripture that look like they could introduce themselves in some sort of a recovery group, right? Why is it that David could be a man after God's own heart and yet commit such sin? Why is it that Moses could be called the humblest man in the world? We see he struggles with his temper when he kills the Egyptian taskmaster, but he's still struggling with his temper after he encountered God at Sinai, when he breaks the law, when he strikes the rock, and eventually keeps him from going into the promised land. These kinds of things, I think, are helpful for us to see that there can maybe be incongruity, not only in any period of thinking, but also that's an incongruity that cuts in our own lives. We need community, we need grace, and we need to be able to unpackage this stuff. So I think that's fair to you. Yes? Chris?
Yes.
Bob Kowski. That's the originals and the first of the new breed.
Okay.
I don't know what that means, but it sounded good.
So, Mark, my question's for you. Did a great job of describing the medieval landscape, the thinking, the cosmology. How would you help students today to be able to come from our worldview and take that trip back and appreciate it without imposing on it all of our modern, mechanistic, reductionary points of view? So, how do you really dive into the richness with it with students?
I don't know how to fully answer the question, but Lewis, on 3 separate occasions in The Discarded Image, says, don't listen to anything that I've just said. What you have to do is go out on a dark night, on a night of when the stars are out, and take a walk. And in taking that walk, resolutely assume that pre-Copernican astronomy is true. And he says, I think it will then begin to dawn on you the significance of this universe. And that was really interesting to me, the idea that I can give you all this information, but really the best way to visualize what I've been telling you is to go out and look at the stars and assume that it's a universe to look up at, that it's packed full of significance. So I think that's one way we can help them to visualize that universe. Do you have anything else to add?
No, I think that's right. Lewis says it in The Discarded Image. Mark talked about it tonight, and Michael Ward develops it too in his Planet Narnia, where for the medievalists, the universe had significance, it had meaning, it had purpose, it was created. Creation implies intention, or as Dante said in the De Monarchia, function precedes essence. Before God made us, he had purposes for us. So consequently, in a materialistic world, there is no purpose. Matter's eternal, it's not going anywhere, we're not going anywhere. We lose significance, we lose meaning. The one thing that the medievalists can give us is, while their image was a discarded image, and as Mark said, our image too will be a discarded image one day, we could at least learn that the medievalist did not lose his sense of significance and meaning. There was a reason why each of us was here, and it matters. Really is incredible. I'll go a step further. It's just a little thing. I have 4 children. They're all married, and I have 13 grandchildren. And we just heard over Christmas that we've got 2 more grandchildren coming. And I was kind of glad because we had 13, and even the dwarves in Hobbit could not go rescue their ancestral home with 13. They needed Bilbo. So I thought if we had a 14th, whether boy or girl, I'm going to nickname it Bilbo. But now we have 15 coming to us. Well, my one son is a pastor in Phoenix, and his wife wanted to have 4 children in 4 years and just sort of get that over with, raise the kids together. Well, she didn't. She had 4 children in 3 years. The last birth was twins. boy and a girl, fraternal twins. And when the grandson was born first, Soren, and then his sister, Briley. Isn't that a pretty name? Briley was born. And the doctor looks at her and says she is anatomically 2 weeks younger than her brother. My daughter-in-law ovulated, became pregnant. 2 weeks into her pregnancy, she ovulated again and had a second pregnancy at the same time. It's so unusual. When Briley was born, I said, God must have wanted her here, right? Wonder what purposes he has for her. Think of all the eggs women carry in their ovaries. Think of all the sperm ejaculated when a man makes love to his wife. The fact that any egg and any sperm connects, every one of you are here against all odds. You beat the odds. Bigger than the lottery, there could be one. God wanted you here. You matter. And I think that that's coming through in this sense of the medieval universe. People matter. There's purpose. And we should treat one another that way. Even Lewis later in the Weight of Glory, he'll say, there are no ordinary people. You've never met a mere mortal. All people, if you see them as they will one day be, will be a perpetual glory, or they will be a horror, the likes of which you see in your worst nightmares. And the eternal weight of glory on us is that each of us has a responsibility to help one another move towards the glory and to stop the kinds of things that might be impeding people in that process. That matters. And the medieval world, I think, talks about that.
And I would just add, to reiterate, it was a universe packed full of significance, and it was very imaginative, and it satisfied the medieval imagination. And I think that's something that our current model doesn't do for us. Lewis says that we look out on space, and it's just this vast, empty, trackless thing where 10 million miles is just as imaginable as 10 billion miles. There's no significance there. There's no imaginative delight in this model. So if there's one thing I could communicate from it to younger people, as you're mentioning, I would say that this model of the universe just brings that significance and that imaginability that we've lost in ours.
And going with that too, it not only brings a sense of significance, Mark emphasized it several times, it comes with a sense of humility. And I would suggest to you gratitude too. And consequently, it cultivates something in our heart that's a little bit different than what we see in our materialistic world. Watch one night of the news. I don't care if you watch conservative or liberal. Whichever side you watch, the other side will be horribly vilified. And with the vilification will come the sense that you should be perfect. But the person who's making the charge doesn't hold that standard up to himself. Or if he did, he would be flush with arrogance. Where's the humility? Instead of saying, you know, this person made a mistake. You know, I've made mistakes too. I think I want to be a little kinder to this person, not to universally project, and maybe dissect this little issue here that we could talk about and make sense of, rather than exploding it out and castigating the other person. When churches do it, it's horrible. We marginalize the struggler, out of fellowship, carnal, backslidden. Well, nobody says it explicitly, implied in that you got to have it all together in this community. And it breeds pretense or fear. I don't want to say what's really going on in my heart, because if I say what's going on in my heart, I know how I'll be treated. I saw how they treated the last person. And consequently, no humility, there's fear, and so on. But Mark, as he reminded us, we look up, we see the glory, the grandeur. We see the kindness and the benevolence, and we see that we can be honest. Humility, I think, is a synonym for honesty. And there can be hope. And it's cool. So go read The Discarded Image. Imagine what's going to happen to your life when you do. Time for one more, maybe? We have Elaine here, too. She's got a medieval name. You know, we can read.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
I don't want the microphone though.
Her son is marrying my grandniece. Isn't that cool?
So, when you talk about looking up to a pre-Copernicus night sky, I'm not looking at truth as we know it. So I'm not basing my imagination on truth. So it's like saying to a child, the underneath of your bed could be so exciting if you imagine fairies to be there. How does that help them? How is that helpful if your imagination isn't based on something that's actually true?
Could you repeat the question?
I think, Jerry, can you repeat the question and do it more sincerely?
She said if you use the word truth as we know it. That's a risky phrase. True, is it truth if we know it and it's not true?
Well, but if I know that the sun is at the center of the universe.
Say it again, because we want to make sure you can hear.
The role of the imagination in truth, I guess that's what I'm asking. Are we ever doing ourselves or other people disservice if we're... I mean, I understand how it's done in literature and through C.S. Lewis, but I also want... I was just thinking about Mr. Neal's comment on the wonder of looking at the sky pre-Copernicus.
Truth is not reality. Truth is what I think about reality when I think accurately about it. So there has to be something that confirms the truth claim. And if I think of something false, this is an elephant, there's no reality to support that claim. So consequently, it could be falsified. Any truth that I do know, I don't know completely, however. So how am I going to go deeper with that truth or wider with its applications? And that will require me moving outside of the realm of what I do know. And that will require something of the imagination. So even the scientist begins his or her method with a hypothesis. It's not true. But we can test it, and we could at least get a more proximate understanding of the data that's before us, and maybe even shape some truth claims about it. And then even then, we hold those truth claims with humility, and we can go deeper and wider and so on. Does that make sense? Is that helpful at all? Doesn't seem to be scratching where you're itching.
Can I add to it?
You need that?
No, I don't think so.
And Lou's back there, he had a question too. I'm sorry.
Well, the idea that the imagination, as we use our imaginations, we can only get things that are false, I think is inaccurate. So if you think about God is infinite. And Jerry, you've given me this idea. God is infinite. He breaks the category of definition. Definition, the word means of the finite. So we can't apprehend God with our reason. We can only apprehend him through our imagination. And so Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven is like. He tells metaphors and stories so that we can imagine something that is otherwise unimaginable. And so our imaginations, you can't say, oh, I can't understand truth because I'm imagining it. Sometimes that's the only way we can understand truth.
Some things can be grasped with the imagination in that regard. But there is a value in story. We can taste and see through story. But while that's true, we have to understand story itself has a place. If I'm going to the moon, I don't want the physicists who are charting my trajectory to be sitting around telling Goldilocks and the three bears to each other. I want them to deal with the hard math, and I want them to deal with those particulars. But doesn't mean, though, there's some things I can't grasp with the imagination. And these are real, these are actual, but they're probably going to be less definitive, as Mark said. So I have to be careful how I use the word. I want to be precise, I want to avoid as best I can any kind of slipshodness in the process of thinking. We had two more, I don't know. Maybe what we'll do is we'll wait up here. If you guys want to ask questions, we'll be here, okay? Just out of respect for the rest of you. Can I pray? Did we start in prayer? Or did we? You prayed, huh?
You prayed, and then I've got one or two things.
All right. Father, I thank you for the kindness of the Wade Center, for hosting this, for Marge and her staff. I pray, Father, thanking you for the people that came. And I pray that each one would feel that he or she left with something to reflect on, something that for the next few days will be picking away at them and opening their eyes to see things maybe they hadn't noticed before. And we take this moment, too, to thank you for the gift of C.S. Lewis and how he had these marvelous gifts, how he honed them, how he worked hard, and provided us a vast array of literature that we can read and have it take our breath away. We have no interest in being focused on Lewis, but we want to see beyond him. We want with his eyes to see the kinds of things that he saw. and we want it to take our breath away. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks.
So much to keep talking about. I just wanted to let you know that there's going to be a bit of a gap before the fourth lecture in this series. It doesn't come on our calendar until April 19th. By then, we should be in spring weather. So between then and now, we have a lot of other events that we would welcome you to. You can see them on our website. And Jerry, you're speaking later this week on campus, aren't you? In case you may not be on.
Thursday night, the American Scientific Association.
It's on Lewis and Scientism, right?
Yeah.
And where it'll be in Barrows. So if you get your information through the Wade events list, that won't be on there, but it is on the college calendar, and you're most welcome. Is 7 p.m., Chair? Well, anyway, Thursday night. So thank you all for coming, and have a good evening.